Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar session. My name is Natalie Richardson. I'm Managing Director at Save Your Skin Foundation. I welcome you to today's webinar presentation titled Navigating Clinical Trials and Melanoma Treatment Pathways in Canada. When we receive feedback from patients after webinars or our monthly support group calls, we strive to answer the questions being asked. The most common questions we receive from melanoma patients are about clinical trials. Patients always ask what is the latest news in melanoma treatment today, what clinical trials are open and where, how they can get into these trials, and what their best options are for battling this disease. To help us answer these questions today, we are honored to welcome three highly esteemed physicians and researchers from across Canada. Our valued panelists today are Dr. Marcus Butler from Princess Margaret Cancer Centre in Toronto, Ontario, Dr. Wilson Miller from Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, Quebec, and Dr. Michael Smylie, Cross Cancer Institute, Edmonton, Alberta. Facilitating this discussion will be Kathy Barnard, melanoma survivor and founder and president of Save Your Skin Foundation. Before we get started, there are a few things I would like to mention. All participants in the audience for today's webinar will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the session. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. You will see at the right-hand side of your screen an option to type in a question. Please feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to answer them in the last segment. If there are any questions that do not get an immediate answer, we will contact you with a reply and any discussion you wish to have after the webinar. This session is being recorded, and it will be available for replay on the Save Your Skin Foundation website starting tomorrow. An email notification will also be sent to everyone who registered with a link to the recording. Thank you so much for joining us. We will now begin the presentation. I hand this over to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Nat. Welcome everyone to the webinar. Last night I started trying to write a more detailed introduction bio for our esteemed panel of physicians, but realized just those introductions would probably take the full hour we've scheduled for this webinar. So I'm sure most of the listeners today know of these three gentlemen. But as a patient-founded organization and a patient-led organization, I thought I would introduce them in a few descriptive words that we have heard from their patients. And here they go. A combination of brilliant and endearing, a leader in his field, an educator and an expert, has a lovely manner with his patients. Brilliant, down to earth, patient-centered, an advocate for patients' rights, incredibly diligent and brilliant, knowledgeable and kind. Save Your Skin is proud to say that we have worked closely with all three of these physicians since almost our inception, and are honored to say that all three physicians sit on our medical advisory board. At Save Your Skin, we strive to support their work as much as they strive to save the patients that come into their clinics. As Nat mentioned, we receive feedback from patients after our webinars and after our monthly support group calls, and we strive to answer the questions being asked. The most common questions we receive from melanoma patients now are about clinical trials. So now let's get started. And these are some of the questions directly from our patients. And as Nat suggested, if you have other questions, please go ahead and put them on the screen and we'll read them as we go through. So Dr. Smylie, we're going to start with you. Can you tell our patients the difference between pharma-led versus patient-led clinical trials? What are they? What's the difference in them? And how do patients find these trials?
Well, pharma-led trials tend to be much larger trials, and they're quite often phase 2 or phase 3 studies. So a lot of these studies are registration trials where the drug company is trying to get the drug registered and a notice of compliance from Health Canada. I think typically in my experience that the really breakthrough drugs that we get in melanoma, most of these drugs come from the pharma-led trials, and they have a vested interest in getting these trials done quickly and getting them done properly. And as a physician, it's good because we get access to these drugs, and for a patient, it's also good because they get access to groundbreaking treatments. When you look at center-led trials or smaller group trials, they tend to be sort of investigator-initiated, where they might be looking at a small subset of patients or identifying a marker or adding in another drug to an existing one. They tend to be smaller and just sort of really discovery or phase 2 trials. And then some of the larger cooperative group trials are answering more fundamental questions, like the one we have right now is a stopgap, that's looking at the How long do we have to give a PD-1 inhibitor for, or can we stop at best response, or do we go on for the 2 years?
Dr. Butler, Dr. Miller, anything that you could add?
I would just add that, for better or for worse, the most important trials, both for the initial introduction of promising new drugs and for the final determination of whether they're an improvement on the standard of care, are almost always the pharmaceutical run trials. And that has advantages and disadvantages. They do a lot of the work setting it up, which makes it easier for us to do, and they fund it. But the disadvantage is they control all the data. They make all the decisions with respect to the design and follow-up and reporting of the trial, and that is not necessarily always what academic physicians interested in just the science and patient benefit might decide.
Dr. Butler?
Yeah, I think that it's important to understand that there are lots of different types of trials beyond the typical pharma trials. There's the concept of cooperative groups, or the Canadian Clinical Trials Group is a group of academic physicians at sites throughout the country that are interested in doing clinical trials. When we do a Canadian Clinical Trials Group trial, the pharmaceutical industry may be supporting the trial, but then it's done in a collaborative way so that the cooperative group actually runs the nuts and bolts of the trial. So then it becomes kind of a hybrid type of experience. And those trials can sometimes be quite big as well, because you might be answering a question that involves a small number of patients, rare cancer, and multiple investigators need to team up together to do the study. And then you'll have these investigator-initiated studies, which are often very tiny, just one single site, where a question is being answered in a small number of patients. A lot of those studies may be very innovative and new type of treatments, but are very biomarker heavy, involve a lot of testing at the site of the investigator, and may involve a lot more activities that the patient has to participate in. So there's quite a big variety of trials out there.
Can I ask you quickly, the Pharma Led trials, how do they choose the centers? Do you know that? Is it by volume? Is it by population? How are the centers that do these clinical trials decided from the Pharma Led? Dr. Butler?
So usually for these types of studies, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the pharmaceutical industry. So the companies really want to get the study done in a short amount of time, because every month that a study is open, it costs them money. So they want to open and finish the trial in a very short amount of time. So therefore, they need to have a center that's large, that has a large number of patients, and also they're looking at the quality of the data that's generated from the group. So if one of the elements of clinical trials with pharma is that we see the patient, we observe whether they're benefiting from the treatment, and then there's a group of people that spend time entering all of these results into electronic data repositories. The patient's identity is anonymized, so that nobody knows that this is Mrs. Smith, that's this 46-year-old woman. But the data has to be input, and that takes effort and time. So pharma is also looking at the quality of the data that's input, making sure that there's not mistakes, and therefore it needs to be groups like the centers that currently conduct clinical trials in Canada, where they're able to meet those requirements and stand up to audit by the groups like the FDA or Health Canada.
Sorry, Dr. Smylie, I think I had heard you start to comment earlier. If you want to say something.
No, I just agree with what Marka said, and I think a lot of it just comes on, again, as Marka said, the quality of the data that we can do. And we're fortunate in Canada, we have large academic centers with a large referral population, so we don't have to compete for patients like they do in the United States. We already have that large referral basis, and I think that a lot of it goes on our track record too. So if we've done several studies and we have good track record, then they usually prioritize those larger centers to have them participate in any new trials that they're opening up.
Dr. Miller, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I would emphasize Michael's point that because of the structure of cancer care across Canada and the different financial incentives that are here than in the U.S., it's much easier to get patients on the right clinical trial, wherever that might be in their area.
Okay, well, Dr. Miller, let's go to the next question then. How do the patients find these clinical trials? Like, we know that you can go to, clinicaltrials.gov, but do the Canadian Clinical Trial Group, do they have theirs listed on there as well? Do you know?
I believe they do. I don't know how easy it is to find. I know the trials across the McGill network, which are now run by this Rossi Cancer Network, are at our Rossi Cancer Network website. We try to keep it up to date, but as you know, trials change all the time, so we're not always perfect. There is also a provincial organization called JAOC, which has the trials listed, but they are usually, unfortunately, quite out of date, and I assume there are similar things in Ontario and Alberta.
Well, and to be honest, a lot of patients that diagnosis probably wouldn't know to even go to a database like that. They would be kind of depending on their, whoever their physician is at that point to be leading them in that direction.
Well, that's exactly right. I think the key people to get patients to clinical trial are the treating oncologists, and that requires that patients are referred to oncologists, which most of the time they are, but as we know, especially in skin malignancies, sometimes people fall between the cracks.
Exactly. Well, I want to go back to something you said about, these clinical trials coming to the larger centers, because of data collection. And we know right now how important that real world evidence and that data are in our drug approval process. So can you tell us from each of your centers sort of, what happens with the information you learn from those trials and how the patients can continue to be part of that dialogue and that data, not just during treatment, but sort of, above and beyond that as well. Dr. Smylie, I'd like to start with you.
Okay, well, I think when you do clinical trials, that there is a consent process that patients sign. And in that consent, it states that if any new information becomes available during the conduct of that trial, the patient has to be informed. So ethically and morally, we're obliged to inform the patients of any updates. There are data safety monitoring committees that follow the data. So if they see that one drug is superior to the other, and the classic was the BRIM-3, where they looked at dacarbazine versus vemurafenib, when they saw that the vemurafenib was clearly superior, which we all knew was going to happen, they closed the study and said that any patients who are receiving the dacarbazine, when they progress, should be crossed over and receive the new drug. Also, when the study is done and the blind is broken, patients are always informed of what treatment they were on. Some of the trials allow us to do that earlier when they progress, so that makes it easier for patients and for us for treatment decisions. And we also are obligated to inform the patients of the results of any trials that we get. So for example, the 054 study that looked at pembrolizumab versus placebo, as soon as we got the results, we were informed all of our patients what they received in that, and that the study was positive, and when the blind is broken, they're informed of what they were actually on.
Dr. Miller?
Yeah, so Michael said it exactly right. I would give even a more recent example. There was an adjuvant therapy trial of 3 different immunotherapies, and when a separate trial was read out that one of the three was inferior to another one of the three, they quickly closed down that group and restructured the new trial to just compare the two that hadn't been previously compared.
Dr. Butler, do you collect data sort of following those patients through survival as well?
Yeah, so it's a good question, what you're asking about. So the trial itself and what the pharmaceutical industry collects is based on what's in the protocol and the consent form and the objectives of the particular study. One of the things that the pharmaceutical industry has trouble is that they can't really access what happens to the patient after they've fulfilled the objectives of the trial that they wrote. So if there were some effect of sequential therapy, unless they specifically said that that's what they were going to collect information on, it may be lost to the drug company. So for that reason, there is an effort in Canada and elsewhere to collect real-world evidence as well as comprehensively understand what happens to patients after they receive various therapies on or off clinical trials. So there are database collections where the overall status of patients, a series of different drugs that they've received is collected. And in Canada, we have a joint effort between all of our centers to try to collect this kind of data together and then team up to combine the data to answer important questions.
You know, in the beginning days when I started melanoma, we didn't really need to collect much data because there wasn't much to collect. But now that we're seeing, you know, a good majority of our patients, you know, moving into survivorship with all these innovative medicines, you know, we, you know, as an advocacy group, see really the importance of sort of following that patient, you know, sort of through the entire process. Because when it comes to submitting the patient submissions into the P-coder, you know, we sort of want to see the overarching arch of survivor curve of where melanoma has gone over the last, you know, 10 years. My next question, Dr. Smylie, is, you know, we've got the research centers versus regular hospital settings. And, you know, we know that patients have very little control over where they are sent when they're referred after diagnosis. So, you know, when we're talking about, and I don't like to use the word center of excellence, but when we're talking about those larger centers, you know, how do our patients themselves get to those centers, and can they get to those centers? You know, whether they're from a rural area or whether they're even from another province.
Well, every patient has a right to request a referral to a larger center. And I think any very motivated melanoma patient who really wants cutting edge treatment should and can request a referral to a large center to see what trials are available, or else they can just do it by telephone to see if they're eligible for any trials. We're quite fortunate in Alberta, northern Alberta, because we have a melanoma clinic that's staffed by surgeons, dermatologists, and oncologists. And so about 95% of the melanoma patients will come through that clinic. So a lot of the rural doctors and smaller cities will refer patients up there, and then triage to see the appropriate specialists. And then so a lot of they're often followed by the dermatologist. And if they recur, then the medical oncologist can see them the same day in clinic. And so it's fortunate for us because we're able to see those patients very, very quickly. We can offer them standard of care. And I think most of the other centers that have oncologists will, because they only see a few melanomas per year, they will refer them up to Edmonton just for an opinion.
Dr. Miller, how does that work in Quebec? Is it quite similar?
My apologies. I just had to step out for a minute for a patient problem. Which trial are we talking about?
Sorry, we're just talking about the research centers versus hospital settings, and how do patients get to the larger centers for these clinical trials? You know,
so again, it's all the oncologists. You know, I try to keep oncologists who I know in some of the regional centers aware of the important trials that we have, and I get a lot of referrals from them. Occasionally, there is a patient who, even though he or she was not recommended by the oncologist, will seek us out because they've heard we have, you know, late the latest and greatest of trials.
Dr. Butler, you got a pretty large province. How do you get all those patients coming to those large centers?
Well, there are multiple centers in Ontario that do clinical trials, and often we won't have the same trial open in every single center in order to sort of streamline some of the data collection issues. And for some of the other popular trials, there may be multiple centers that are open. It is a challenge for rare diseases where basically patients have to travel a long distance in order to get access to these new novel agents, but that's the nature of the beast. We do have patients that travel across province to get to some different treatments. We try to mitigate some of the challenges with trying to streamline getting patients in and out, but in general, it's a big commitment to be on a clinical trial for patients. And I know from your experience as a patient, you traveled thousands of miles back and forth.
Yes, I went to Alberta, so I was kind of one of the fortunate BCers that could cross that line. But not all physicians are aware of all the new and innovative medicines still. And we had this discussion 5 years ago because we all started really trying to push the needle forward and educate as much as we could. But is there anything else that you think Save Your Skin could do to help patients sort of understand the clinical trial process? I know lots of times we refer them to the clinical trial, Gov database, or we sort of slide them through to one of your centers. But is there anything more innovative you think we could do to help the patients kind of streamline that system?
Well, Kathy,
sorry. No, go ahead.
Sorry, Kathy, you already have a very active website and you get a lot of hits per day and have done phenomenal work for the patients. And maybe it might be a good initiative for Save Your Skin to try to list some of these trials on your website, and they can be updated on a regular basis just so that patients can go on your website, access clinical trials, and see what centers are participating. And that would be a good patient tool for them to use, because the clinicaltrials.gov site that often people look up, those trials are very outdated. And I've got calls where trials have been closed for like 3 or 4 years, but it states we're still active. And
Dr. Miller, anything, or Dr. Butler to add?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We would be happy to send you periodic updates of our, most interesting trials. Probably would not be possible in the phase 1-2 setting where you have different cohorts that open and close quickly, and occasionally you have a early stage trial that's just perfect for somebody with melanoma, but they only opened the cohort for 6 patients with melanoma and it was closed 3 weeks later. Probably can't get you that, but for the big melanoma trials, they're going to last for 6 months to a year or so. Maybe it's a good idea to have those on your site with the locations across Canada. Another point I wanted to make, actually, I think it's very important for patients to understand the value of clinical trials. And I think melanoma has been the leader in proving the value of clinical trials because, pretty much all the new drugs that have transformed the care of melanoma have been available years before on clinical trials than they were funded by the provinces. And, so patients on clinical trials have had a lot of success. And I think just the process of the clinical trial means you have expert doctors who have a full staff of people watching everything to make sure that you get the best possible care. And, when you're just at your regional center with your regular oncologist, sometimes, not everything is as carefully monitored. So patients will trust you more to tell them that than they will us.
Dr. Butler?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that you're really interested in is how to, if you're a patient and you either present with disease and you want to know what is the best uh, next step or for initial step for treatment. One of the ways that you can ensure that you at least have access to all of the options is to have an assessment by a melanoma expert. And there are melanoma experts throughout the country in every province, people that are specializing in this disease and maybe specialize in a couple of other diseases as well. But as a group, we all talk to each other and we're all in general aware of the different options that are out there. So for instance, I know that Michael knows that we have a TIL program, that we have a cell therapy program, that it might not be something that you want to do for first-line treatment, but if the disease appears to be growing, then he'll reach out and say, hey, I have this patient. Is there anything out there that that they may need to think about for next steps? And then I'll let him know what's going on at our center, and he can, talk to the patient about traveling out here if necessary. But in general, before we refer patients across the country, we make sure that there's something that might be of interest, and it may just involve a single visit to sort of do some pre-screening to then know about options for down the line. Also, we will, in our own province, if an oncologist in the community that treats melanoma but isn't really involved in trials, they'll often email us and say, I have a patient who has X, or what are the trial options? And we'll share that information with them. And then if the patient's interested in traveling down for these options, then they will, and then make a decision on whether to do standard of care or to do a clinical trial.
You kind of segued me into the next question.
Oh, sorry.
No, perfect. I wanted to ask a little bit about, what's going on sort of across the country. So, Mike, could you give us a little insight on some of the clinical trials that you're working on in melanoma?
So I think some we have different trials across the country, and a lot of the trials are focusing still on the immune checkpoints, and they're also focusing on ways to try to augment the activity of the immune checkpoints. I think we're all disappointed to see the IDO inhibitor trial that was negative, the epacadostat. But currently we have a first-line trial that's going to open up shortly and is looking at nivolumab plus a novel drug called NKTR-214, which is actually a conjugated interleukin-2, so very similar to the old drug that you got, except it's attached to polyethylene glycol molecule, so it's a prodrug and it has to be hydrolyzed, and it's supposed to have more select activity for the active T cells as opposed to regulatory T cells. So we're combining that with PD-1 as a first-line treatment. And it's a randomized trial, so the control group will be PD-1 alone versus the combination. And then we have a second-line trial looking at IPI plus a toll-like receptor agonist 9. We have a couple of investigator-initiated studies, the ratio studies, where we're doing biopsies, doing inflammatory signatures to see if we can predict who's going to respond to immunotherapy. And then we have a small molecule study that's looking at different immune checkpoint markers that John Walker is doing. Then we have the Keynote 716 study that we're going to be activating hopefully soon, and it's going to look at high-risk stage 2 patients and randomize them between pembrolizumab versus placebo. And then we're participating in the stopgap, which is the CCTG study being done through the clinical trials group in Canada.
Wow, we've come a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Miller, how about you? What have you got? Anything interesting in Quebec?
Oh, yeah, we have some of the same trials. In fact, I think we're trying to open the first trial Michael talked about. But in general, we try to have at least one trial for everybody who is either first line, and that can be a targeted trial or an immune trial, or sometimes we've had a combination of targeted therapy and immune trial. And then we try very hard these days for second-line trials for patients who have failed PD-1 targeted therapy. I think the next big target, and so far a bit elusive goal, is how do you best treat patients who have failed PD-1 inhibitors. And we've had a number of trials that have opened and closed because we haven't found the perfect combination. But we are continually looking for new trials. And this is kind of the early trial that has a cohort for those patients just to see if it might work, and then that opens and closes quickly. So, I don't want to go into a lot of detail of what exact trials we have open today, but in general, we try to have something for people in most situations. There are some problems for subgroups that are chronically excluded from trials. Uveal melanoma, I think that was on your list, is one such a problem. Some trials even refuse mucosal melanoma. Trials often refuse patients with brain mets, even though we have dramatic data that both targeted therapy and the more aggressive immune therapies can work in patients with brain mets. So it's a complex, always evolving field.
Dr. Dr. Butler, you talked about the TIL. Did Dr. Smylie, do you have that in Edmonton?
No, we don't.
You don't? So,
no.
Dr. Butler, do you know of any other centers other than yours that has that clinical trial?
Montreal is looking at starting a TIL program, and I think Victoria, but not in melanoma, is looking at cell therapies. And then we have gene-engineered TCRT clinical trials as well, where we're investigating cell therapies to try to use anti-tumor T cells through cell infusion as treatment. Other types of trials that we have at Princess Margaret, they have basically many of the same studies that Wilson and Michael have mentioned. We work closely with the phase 1 program, where if we don't have something in the melanoma center, we may have appropriate trials available in the phase 1 program, and we can identify patients appropriate for those trials. For uveal melanoma, we are participating in the Immunocore IMC GP100 studies. Unfortunately, that's limited to about 40% of the patients with uveal melanoma because it requires HLA-A2 positivity, and not everyone is HLA-A2 positive, but it is showing some promise, so we have patients participating on those protocols.
Dr. Smylie, are you looking into that trial as well for the ocular?
We are, yeah, and we've actually got it open now, so we just saw 2 patients yesterday that we offered it to. So again, as Marcus said, it's only about 40% of the patients would be eligible for it.
Well, we heard a lot at ASCO this year about a lot of the work being done in adjuvant treatment in melanoma. So we know, I think you've mentioned a few clinical trials in that adjuvant setting that you've got going. Do you foresee more clinical trials coming in that setting, Dr. Smylie?
There will. So I think the big trials that have been completed is the looking at the combination of a CTLA-4 inhibitor plus a PD-1. So it's a low-dose CTLA-4 inhibitor versus nivolumab, and we'll see if adding 2 drugs offers any benefit in progression-free survival compared to just the PD-1 inhibitor. I think the longer follow-up of these trials will be really interesting to see where their survival goes at 5 years and whether or not we get improvements in overall survival. The Keynote 054 was an excellent trial because they allowed a crossover. So if you received the placebo and you progressed, the code was broken, then you were allowed to go on to PD-1 to see if you could salvage the survival benefit. And that will answer the question about whether or not you can really improve survival by giving early stage 3 patients PD-1 as opposed to only treating those patients who recur. So that design was excellent, and so longer follow-up of that will be really interesting.
Dr. Butler, anything to add on adjuvant?
Other than we need to have more adjuvant trials in the future because we're needing to try to figure out ways to optimize prevention of recurrence. And there's currently a gap between the data that's been shown with benefit for adjuvant and actually having access to these drugs as part of standard of care.
Dr. Miller?
Yeah, I think two things. One, what Marcus just said, we have great data now for adjuvant therapy that appears to offer a genuine benefit for stage 3 melanoma. I think all of us would agree high-risk stage 2 melanoma is just as likely to benefit from these therapies, and for that we have at least one upcoming trial I'm aware of, and maybe some others which will allow us to expand the indication for adjuvant therapy eventually into high-risk patients who don't meet the restrictive criteria for the first wave of adjuvant trials.
Well, you just reminded me that Save Your Skin needs to get to work a little bit on building our patient database on that stage 2 and 3 patient for when we do start seeing those clinical trials come into Canada, and when we start, needing to collect our patients for our patient submission through the P-coder. I don't really have any other questions here to ask. If anybody on the line has any, please go ahead and type them in. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I kind of want to take advantage of the three of you here, because you've been in melanoma for quite a while, and just recently I saw an article about one of you being a rock star. So Dr. Smylie, can you take a couple minutes and just, kind of revisit where we were, where we are today? Because I think sometimes, we forget how far we have gone in the last 10 years. And I'd like to kind of remind our newly diagnosed patients that it's a different place today than it was in 2006 when I was diagnosed. Can you kind of take a couple of minutes to kind of, go back in time to where you are and now to where you are today?
Sure, I'm probably the most appropriate to answer that because I'm the oldest. So I think that it was a pretty dismal disease back in the early 90s, and it was very hard to get any clinical trials going. And I remember approaching several pharmaceutical companies about sponsoring investigator-initiated trials, and being told by the medical lead, who was previously a melanoma specialist, telling me that melanoma really is a low priority for pharma because it's a small site, and they just had no plans to go there. And so it's very difficult to get pharmaceutical companies to engage in clinical research. Every single trial we ever did was negative. The progression-free survival was basically the first evaluation. So if you did your CT scans at 6 weeks, that was your progression-free survival. If you did it at 8 weeks, that was your progression-free survival. And then Ed Korn in 2008 did his meta-analysis and showed that we had made no progress in melanoma in 50 years. And then the next year, we had our very first positive study ever in melanoma, where the ipilimumab compared to GP100 was positive, and from there it's really been a revolution. We've just exploded, and it's kind of exciting because melanoma really is leading the charge in this cancer revolution with using all these immune checkpoints. And so it's a fun tumor, and Marcus and Wilson probably find the same thing, that I am busier than I've ever been because my patients are doing so much better and the clinics are swelling because it's a bottleneck. They're coming in and patients are doing well, and it's very different from the way it was 10 years ago.
Marcus, you're smiling.
Yeah, it
Well,
does.
I'm looking at my overbooked clinic list right now, and they're asking me to open up another clinic because of too many patients. And I'm like, well, I don't have any time. I need to take a vacation day.
I got the same email this morning to open up two extra days.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I had to see my new patients for today yesterday because I had too many other patients. So I think we all are victims of our success.
Well, we haven't got any questions from our participants, but our patients know that they can email us after the webinar, and they know that we can probably get back to the three of you if we need some answers. I just need to remind patients that of a few things. Firstly, your melanoma task force of physicians across this country are spectacular. Your dedication to melanoma is, I don't even know the right adjective, is quite astonishing. You started in the dark days, and you are the victims of your success now. But we are also the survivors of your success. And, every time I see you guys, I can't thank you enough for what you do for the patients with melanoma across this country, and continue to do, and will continue to do, because I'm not going to let any of you retire. I want to also remind patients that, you know, our melanoma doctors, I don't know, Mike, you can remind me when your melanoma conference started. I think are we at year 10 now?
I think we're 12 now, aren't we? Isn't it 12 coming up? Yep.
But every year our dedicated melanoma physicians and, you know, researchers and clinicians and dermatologists meet, usually either in Banff or BC, and sort of educate everybody on what's coming, what's happening with melanoma, so everybody's up to date. So that's happening, I guess, again this year, January, February. So we'll keep our patients informed of that. And yeah, I just want to thank the three of you for honestly everything you do for us and you do for our patients. And, you know, I always know you're a phone call away, and I thank you for that. Natalie, I'll hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you so very much. I actually there are a few messages coming in, and they're mainly of thanks. Patients who are listening, they want to thank you for your dedication to making clinical trials available and for all the work you do, of course. I did also get one. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I think we as physicians also have to thank the patients, because melanoma patients are always special. And there used to be a joke that you could tell a melanoma patient coming to the clinic because they had the internet search under their arm. Those are back in the days when it was printed out in this long computer paper. And melanoma patients have always been engaged in their treatment. They've been very keen to pursue research, and they're just different from any other tumor group that I've ever worked with. So they're extremely special.
It's sort of bittersweet to hear that. Thank you for saying that. I did actually get one question too. I know we did a beautiful thank you there, but if I could slip in one more question. Someone asked about liquid biopsies. There's a lot in the news lately, especially in Australia, about blood tests for melanoma. Is that something that you're working on or see coming to fruition or to Canada, or is it a thing?
Yeah. So we have a group trying to look at circulating tumor DNA as a method for either early detection or for identifying mutations that evolve over time. Currently, we have a study for patients at high risk of relapse where we're collecting samples from patients. Also, we have a pilot study that we've just finished the sample collection in uveal melanoma patients that are at high risk to see whether we could identify patients earlier using that method. But it's definitely a very promising technology. It's evolving over time. It used to be very, very expensive to do this kind of analysis. It's getting much cheaper. So it's definitely an area of research. Ultimately, right now, we need patient participants to be willing to donate blood and to undergo a tumor biopsy, because the only way to really know that the data that you're collecting from circulating tumor DNA correlates with what's in the tumor is to actually get access to the tissue. So there's a lot of research in the area, but it's definitely very promising. Not at a stage where we're doing it as part of standard of care yet. We still need areas of research.
Interesting. Thank you. Dr. Miller, Dr. Smylie, do you have?
Same for us. We are actively interested in it, but it is not yet available to practically determine care.
That's fair. Thank you. Okay, well, I will just echo Kathy's thanks and warm sentiments for your time today. Thank you very much for helping us with all of these questions. We really value your input and feedback. And I'll thank everyone as well for joining this webinar session today as an audience. As a reminder, this presentation will be available online at savourskin.ca starting tomorrow. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to send them to us at natalie@savourskin.ca or Kathy@savourskin.ca. And we will be keeping you posted on if we make additions to our savourskin.ca/about clinical trials page with detailed updates from Dr. Miller. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and this ends the webinar session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, Mark.